You're in the Affordable Housing Now More Than Ever panel, and as the last panel of the day, I think we'll try to make it the most exciting panel of the day. If there's one to beat, let us know. Usually in the affordable housing world, we can do that. So before I introduce my panelists, my name is Matt Murphy. I'm the Executive Director of the NYU Furman Center. We're a joint research center between NYU's Law School and Public School of Service. I'm going to give a quick overview of our housing stock in the city and why we do affordable housing work, or why you might have heard of it, or why you're here today. New York City houses a population of about 8.5 million people. There are about 3.5 million housing units. We are a unique city relative to the rest of the country. That is because 2/3 of our population are renters. It's the inverse in the rest of the country, where 2/3 are actually homeowners. Of our renters, about half are rent regulated. So we're going to talk about what that term means, but that means about 1 million renters in the city fall under the purview of the rent regulation system. So when we're talking about affordable housing, though, we're talking about a very specific term, so we're going to dig into some of that nuance. Sometimes this serves as an umbrella term, so I want to pull back some of those layers, because it's actually a very complex world. When we're talking about affordable housing, we're talking about income-restricted housing in which residents, buildings are financed with a combination of public and private tools. This is not public housing, of which has been well documented the issues of the New York City Housing Authority. There's about 175,000 public housing units in the city. While that's a form of affordable housing, we actually consider that to be a completely different kind of type of housing, so we're not talking about public housing today. What we're also not going to talk about in depth today, but maybe is a confusing term, is rent-regulated housing. Rent-regulated housing is not necessarily what we define as affordable housing in the affordable housing world, and that's because it's not income restricted. It's not means tested. However, the vast majority of rent-regulated renters are low income. So we have this very complex world, and we use a combination of tools. The issue in general that the affordable housing community is looking to address is that of our significant renter population, 50% of them about pay more than 30% of their income in rent. We call this rent burdened. That's actually a national term that's been around for about 50 years. 30% of our renters are severely rent burdened. They pay more than 50% of their income in rent. So we are swimming against a tide of extreme need, extreme housing demand, and that's where the affordable housing community kind of operates within. So with that, I'm going to introduce my panel, starting with my direct left. My direct left is Richard Froehlich. Richard is the Chief Operating Officer of the New York City Housing Development Corporation. After Richard is Frank Lane. Frank is the Director of Housing at the St. Nick's Alliance. I should go by the pictures, actually. And Lawrence is the Vice President and Mortgage Officer at the Community Preservation Corporation. And then at the far end is Malcom Punter. Malcom is President and Chief Officer of Harlem's Congregations for Community Improvements, better known as HCCI. So, Malcom, I'm actually going to start with you. I talked a little bit about some of the statistics, and there are many more, of which the Furman Center does a lot. But I want to hear from you, what are some of the reasons that you see as the need for affordable housing in New York City, especially operating at the community level that you do?
And I know we have limited time, but I'll answer that question by enveloping into some of the history of HCCI. HCCI was created in 1986 at a time when New York City, for us long-term, lifelong New Yorkers, was in an economic crisis. If you grew up in New York, you know that Times Square was the most filthiest, crime-ridden place in the world. But if you look at it now, you would never know that. So in 1986, the community in which HCCI was established was the Harlem community in New York City, that iconic community. But let me put it in context. I'm a lifelong Harlemite. My parents my mother came there at 18 years old. My father was born there. My family was there since the 1920s. So that's almost 100 years of our family being in the Harlem community. My parents did not grow up in a Harlem that I grew up, that we found in 1986. They grew up in a Harlem that was vibrant. A lot of Renaissance and music and arts. There was a decline about 30 years that really was parallel with the decline in the city of New York vis-a-vis our example for 42nd Street. So Harlem Congregation was created in that environment by a community of faith-based community workers, clergy, men and women, with the express purpose of revitalizing the Harlem community by capturing, recapturing and put back online the housing stock that had deteriorated over that 30-year period that I mentioned. So the need of housing and affordable housing extends that far, but also it also is important and relevant today, because there's always going to be a class of individuals in particularly in a large city that's not going to be able to purchase their home. So they're going to need rental housing. So you're going to have, as was mentioned, 2/3 of the people in the city of New York are renters, so you have to start from somewhere. So ACCI is a private developer. We own about 90 buildings in the Harlem community. We have almost over 3 million square feet of real estate, and our purpose is to make sure that that real estate stays in that affordable housing sector. What that means is that these are not public housing. These are privately owned housing developments. I myself, as the president and CEO, am the general partner for the real estate assets, so I'm responsible for meeting the demands and meeting the metrics for our investors. So the housing, even though it's classed as affordable, operates and functions just like any other real estate asset. Right? We have to make sure we collect the rent. We have expenses. We have to keep them low, and we have to make sure the housing stays in quality aspect. So what we want to do is make sure we get people who need the housing the most, but once they get into our housing, they may qualify for our housing based on their income. Let's just say they make $40,000 a year. But as the nature of the affordable housing sector in this class, you don't have to continue to make $40,000 a year in order to qualify. You just have to be in that income bracket when you move in. You can increase your income over time. What we want to happen with our renters is that they get into the apartment based on need, but we want them to become upward mobile. So ACCI wraps around services like education services, case management services, credit building services. So ideally for us, our renter will become a homeowner at some time in the future. So we're addressing homelessness, we're addressing that they don't continue to be rent burdened, that they somehow are tied to upward mobility and they can earn a sufficient wage to buy a home, and then hopefully they can transfer that wealth intergenerationally. And then we also want to make sure that we address all the issues in the community by providing education components, daycare, case management services, so that we can build a vibrant community. So around our offices located in Upper Manhattan, we call that area a corridor of social services, because not only are we providing housing, but we're providing all the key elements for someone to be successful and get out of that low-income tax bracket or income bracket.
Thank you, Malcolm. And so, Rich, I'm actually going to turn to you. I'm going to ask you about how the city is in the midst of a major affordable housing plan, but maybe before that, if you could talk a little bit about how that operates within the rent regulation system, and then move on to talk about the city's plan.
So people are probably pretty familiar that the state passed changes to our rent stabilization system in June. And this is having a significant impact on the housing that is supported, that is subject to that regulation. And what has happened is, before there was the ability over time to raise rents on vacancy and perhaps have units that would exit the rent stabilization system. And that has gone away as an option under the current rules, and then the increase in rents has been significantly restricted, and it's changing the dynamic. And so if you had bought real estate prior to that with the expectation, somewhat speculative, about significant increases in rent, it's really become a much more challenging environment. The city, I think, has certain tools that could be helpful for that. Big picture, the city's investment in affordable housing is one of how do we do a market intervention. There's really two sides, right? There's the supply side and the demand side. And on the supply side, we can use certain tools, and I'll go into them a little bit, about what we can do to encourage new affordable housing. On the demand side, we have challenges that people have a hard time finding, being able to afford their rent or being able to find apartments that are affordable to them. And so on the demand side, there are different tools that can be used. On some level, rent regulation is a demand side tool. It in essence holds down rent, and that makes it easier for people to be able to afford. Other interventions there are through subsidies, sometimes direct subsidies through to tenants. Some from the federal side, you may have heard Section 8 voucher, someone who has a voucher, and that'll cover the difference between what they can afford, as Matt had explained, that 30% level, and what the actual rent is. So you may see vouchers there, and there are some other programs from both the city and the state that provide rental assistance, in essence, to that. So we also have interventions on other aspects on the expense side. One of the highest expenses for people who own real estate is real estate taxes. New York is a very high tax place. So we have programs that can reduce the taxes, abate it either or exempt you from any increases in taxes. So there are a variety of tools that are there that in essence is a way for us to buy affordability by reducing your taxes if you're an owner. The other tools are, and we'll go into a little bit more, there are land use tools, and there are also city-owned land itself as a tool. There's subsidies, that is direct loans from the city, and then there are federal resources, the low-income housing tax credit and tax-exempt bonds. And so these are all tools that allow us to help both on the supply side and then also on the demand side. With rent regulation, it's an interesting time, and that's sort of partly what we're, because we're trying to get a sense of what's happened to value, that what people paid for real estate versus what it's now valued at, and understanding about what kind of investment there will be going forward. And so we're sort of trying to figure our way through that. But the good news is that the city does have a strong interest in trying to maintain the strength of the real estate market, and to maintain the housing stock and the quality of the housing that exists in New York. So the challenge, though, that is one of the city has resources, but can only do so much with its resources, and the affordability challenge is so large because the incomes that exist in a lot of our communities are just not high enough, and that's part of the challenge, that general economic issue of where people's incomes are versus where rents are. And we don't have enough tools to necessarily fully address this, which is why we have this housing crisis that continues. But there are these different efforts to try to address that. Rent stabilization itself, as Matt sort of when he was trying to structure the conversation, is sort of this separate thing. It's not means tested like affordable housing. So we're not looking at what people's incomes are. What it is really is sort of a tamper on where rents can go, and that in itself creates affordability, but not necessarily the kind of affordable housing that we're talking about.
Yeah. So maybe as a follow-up, can you just explain a little bit about how a typical affordable housing deal is financed?
Sure. So, and then CPC can follow up with with that conversation as well. For the way we generally finance things is through the issuance of tax-exempt bonds. So we're in essence an affordable housing bank that is publicly controlled by the city. And so we access capital through issuing debt, municipal bonds that are either tax exempt or taxable. And then we make loans to projects that agree to a certain level of affordability. And with those, there are other programs that are tied to it, including real property tax exemptions, as well as subsidies that reduce the cost of borrowing, and then also something called the low-income housing tax credit. Malcom referenced the fact that he's a general partner in partnerships. Those are structured investments where people, generally banks, buy tax losses and tax credits that are available through federal programs, and it reduces the taxes owed by those institutions. And then they buy that and they put in additional capital, that money, basically an equity investment in those projects. And that's mostly the way we do our projects. So it's a combination of using these different tools and providing access to lower cost capital, longer term debt than you normally see, sort of more, instead of like a 7 to 10 year debt that you would see from a conventional market, more like 30 to 40 year debt. So it's attractive in the term, and at a lower cost because we can access lower cost rates because of the tax exemption. So those are the different things that we have, and through that, because the revenues are lower, because we're limiting the rents that can be charged, we're also limiting other things like taxes and the cost of borrowing. And so through those means, we can support the creation or the preservation of affordable housing.
So Frank, kind of following up, what we see is that more deals across the city are mixed income, or the city and state have prioritized putting affordable housing into market rate deals in a way that wasn't really done before. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of what this means in terms of like what somebody has to do to market their units, what opportunities people might have, and what does this mean in terms of the enforcement of kind of regulatory documents?
Right, so Rich mentioned that two of the tools that the city have is the ability to forgive or exempt real estate taxes. Another tool they have is they can give extra floor area bonus to a site for including affordable housing. And so these two tools, the increase in floor area and the real estate exemption, then allow a building that might be 80 or 70% market to have 20% low income or 30% what I would call moderate income. And those buildings then require a access for those units. So the market rate units would just get rented, and these are all rental buildings generally. So the market rate units, and St. Nick's Alliance operates in Williamsburg. So there's some pretty high-end market rate rental and condo buildings in our neighborhood. And so for these developers, they're developing, a 200-unit building in exchange for including 20%, 40 units in that building to be affordable at 80% area median income, a certain targeted number determined through a federal census and stuff. Then they get a real estate exemption. Or if they do 30% of those units at a higher income level, 130%, they're exempt for 35 years. So then they hire a group like us, St. Nick's or HCCI or another nonprofit, to be the administrator, and we are committing to the city that we're going to ensure that every renter of those units is legitimately income eligible. And so that's one of the ways that there's an intersection of market rate and affordable, and it's actually a bigger and bigger portion of what's going on now in terms of what the city's happening, because we have what's called mandatory inclusionary now in rezoned areas, and we have the ability to have that component. And that becomes a really important tool for the developer. They have to sign, as Matt was asking, the long term. They have to sign a regulatory agreement with the city that they're going to keep those affordable units affordable for the period of time as required. Most of the time, if it's inclusionary, that means permanently affordable. The rents increase according to the rent regulations, but they stay affordable. And it becomes a real opportunity to not have to go to HDC or CPC to get subsidy to develop those properties, but create some affordable housing. And they get maintained. And the second tool, I'll say briefly, is There's another tool called the Preservation Inclusionary, where a group like ours, St. Nick's, we have a lot of buildings like HCCI that we developed many, many years ago. And we commit to the city to preserve those buildings as permanently affordable. And then we can sell the floor area and transfer the air rights in the same way you would as an adjacent building transfer of air rights. We can sell the air rights to one of these developments that's in a specific zone in Williamsburg. And with that money, we renovate our building and create a large reserve, and we keep our building permanently affordable. The market rate building gets to add more units. And it becomes a real good opportunity for us. We look on it as capturing the excessive real estate market in the neighborhood that's making it unaffordable for people to live, to try and preserve or create other housing through that.
Great. So Lawrence, maybe I can turn to you, because at CPC, you're a lender, and you guys lend on affordable housing, new construction, and preservation projects. Can you just talk a little bit about what you as a lender look for if somebody comes to you to kind of seek financing to preserve or build?
I think my fellow panelists have adequately lined up what it takes in order to create and preserve affordable housing. The partnership, both through private and public partnership, is critical. And having a lender who provides the financial resources in order to get projects done and completed is a very important component of the affordable housing landscape. I come from a conventional lending background, having worked at Chase, Banco Popular, which is now Popular Community Bank, for many years, and so I understand the nuances that a conventional lender brings to the affordable housing financing package, in that, you know, there's a responsibility that most of the larger banks have as it relates to CRA, community reinvestment, and reinvesting back into communities. And so they've created platforms within their banks to address and respond to the financing needs. But now I'm strategically situated in a not-for-profit who is one of the largest CDIFs in the nation, and we come to it with a whole different mindset of mission and how we lend. And so, you know, we typically lend to entities, borrowers that are less experienced, perhaps don't have the capability to go to a larger institution to find financing, and you know, so we create that lending niche that creates opportunities for my fellow colleagues, Malcom and Frank, to come to and seek that financing. And when I think about HDC, typically the role that banks play there is they provide the credit enhancement that enhance the bonds that are issued. And so there's a vital role that lenders play. And it really comes to looking at the development project itself and looking at the markets that we operate in and looking at the players. One thing I want to say, you know, to operate and to be a practitioner in this affordable housing landscape, it's not for the faint of heart. You know, it takes someone who's able to go through the nuances of the multiple layers of financing that is needed to bring a project to fruition. There are multiple capital stacks that one has to understand, and we work in that area to help to educate as well as provide the technical assistance, but also provide the knowledge and the skill set that helps developers who are looking to create affordable housing to move through those various programs that are offered not only by the state but also by the city. And so we work hand in hand with HPD, which is Housing Preservation and Development, and their various programs that are geared towards providing the access to capital that is needed for the creation of affordable housing. So I think that kind of
Yeah, absolutely.
sums
And
it up.
Absolutely. And so talk about capital. And so Frank and Malcolm, I'll ask you both as providers, the builders and kind of managers of affordable housing. Just talk a little bit about kind of what it takes to provide housing. What are some of the steps in the process in terms of, we have complicated zoning code, building code. Are there ways that people can navigate that by partnering with affordable housing developers? Are there kind of steps in that process that are particularly challenging that the group should know about?
So I'll answer that question by giving a couple of examples. So while affordable housing is a broad term, it means a lot of things. And it could mean that you're concentrating on the lowest income band, what we call very affordable, which is somebody that might make $25,000 a year. But it also could mean that you go all the way up to someone that can, buy a first-time home. And in that scenario, we talk about the 165% of AMI, 165 of the area median income. And that could be someone making $110,000 a year, a family. So there's a lot to work with within that affordable housing definition. But what HCCI has done is we've constructed about 85% on the very low income side, but about 15% on the mixed income. And what that means is that we've developed condominiums, we've developed cooperative apartments, and we've developed mixed income rentals. And how we segment that is that, for the most part, we will develop on our own up to about $35 million. Anything above $35 million in development cost, we partner with a for-profit developer. We've been very successful in partnering for-profit developers, some of them that you may know. For example, the L&M partners, Exact Capital. We even partnered with the Lamb Group. He's part of this network, so you might know them. Tom Lamb on the Victoria Hotel, an affordable housing project on 125th Street, the largest project in the Harlem community. It's about $200 million. HCCI, as a skilled and not-for-profit with a track record, was able to bring in the low-income housing tax credits that will finance and underwrite the affordable housing component of those two towers there. There's a lot of nuances on the affordable housing development side, and the non-for-profit developer who's been in the space for 30, 40 years play a key role in making sure that affordable housing is included in those mixed projects so that the community will agree that these projects can be done. Because there's a process in the local community boards that will be required to be approved through the local community boards for these developments if you hope to get approval from the land use process or the city planning or the borough president. So it is a very complex project component, and it takes a lot of patience. And if I were to tell you a time frame, in an affordable housing deal, it's going to be 5 to 7 years before you can get it done. So that's the time horizon. And one of our recent projects is a senior housing development that is located on 146th Street in Harlem. It's a 65-unit, very complex. It was a HUD 202 financing, but it also had TCAP financing, tax credits. The capital stack was so complex that it took really a few years to get it done. But what I'm happy to report is that when we got to the placed in service time, we were able to help seniors that came from the Black American community, the Latino community, and actually the Asian community. 1/3 of the occupants in the building are Mandarin-speaking Chinese resident. So this can be very rewarding as a housing developer.
I would say, the process to develop a project that's affordable housing, if it's 100% affordable housing, the challenge is really, like anything else, the land. And so the city, generally, the affordable housing that gets developed 100% tends to be land that is acquired from the city or from the state or from the federal government, because you can't beat it buying land for $1. okay? If I don't have to pay to buy the land, then it's a lot easier to have.
Want to be an affordable developer.
Oh, I can answer that right now, but not just me.
But, you know, so getting all the subsidy, you know, the trade-off is, you know, your upside potential market and all of that based on regulatory agreements. But those that are sitting here have made it their business model and have been very successful at it. And I think that is one of the things, you know, the ones that are the most successful are the ones that are able to partner from a knowledge set and also have the track record and experience, the financial strength, and the wherewithal. And I think, you know, adding the tax credit component to it is a valuable asset. Usually there's a lower entry into it in terms of equity into a deal. And so on a regular market rate deal where, you know, we're lending 70% loan to cost and you got to come up with 30% equity in real cash, you know, most affordable deals, the minimum equity required for a for-profit developer is about 10%. For a not-for-profit, it's 2%. And so, you know, what makes up the rest of the capital stack is the equity that comes in either through tax credit equity or through subsidy that is a form of equity in these affordable deals.
I think also, number one, you know, we heard in the panel just beforehand the softening of the market, right? There is no softening of the market for low-income housing, right? You don't have to worry about finding people that want to get in there, right? There will be customers, right?
Right.
And number two, you know, HDC and HPD subsidy is a huge security blanket in those deals because the city is invested in making sure that they're a success. It doesn't mean that they're always going to be a success and there isn't risk. But from a risk to reward line, whatever chart, you know, it's much lower risk.
So
you know, and it's lower reward, but much lower risk.
So in the cyclical downturn, you know, when, you know, especially 2008, when everything kind of blew up, you know, affordable housing developers were still in the game to some extent, to the extent that, you know, you weren't with a for sale project and had to find a mortgage, but if you were in a rental situation, you know, people still need places to live.
I mean, by its nature, affordable housing is counter-cyclical. The challenge is that we haven't had a counter-cycle. So it's just, everything's just gotten so much more expensive. So that is a true challenge. And as Frank was saying, the demand is enormous. So we run an online lottery system. Now, people can apply for housing through more direct methods, and it's not all online. But it's mostly online. And because of that, we now literally will have over 100,000 applicants for a new building. So there's enormous demand, and it speaks to the challenge that people have in New York. It's an expensive place, and people have a hard time finding units that they can afford to rent. And so the demand is ceaseless, which is why we do need to do supply-side work to create more development. Part of the challenge that we face is that, once again, that cost structure, it's funny, a lot of our programs are tied to inflation. And because overall inflation's been so low, it's really tricky because the construction cost side is going at a 3 times inflation rate. So while inflation may be 1-2%, on the construction side it's 5 to 10%. And that's annual, and it just keeps on going. And so we, you know, the tools we have, on some level, the value goes down because those costs go up so much. So that's part of the pressure that we face. And obviously it's a pressure that New Yorkers face as well, because, you know, while inflation overall may seem like it's not gone up much, on rents it has. And that that may change again now, as I was talking about before about rent stabilization, but there is this real challenge, and people feel it.
So I'm going to do a quick summary, and then we'll open it up for questions if people have them. So I'm going to say, so as a result of need and extreme demand. Federal law, like the Community Reinvestment Act, who somebody mentioned, and the tools that the federal government makes available, and sustainable operations. Affordable housing is actually a really sophisticated industry in New York City, and and there are ways to partner. Also say, so we use zoning, we use financing, tax benefits to buy affordability, but these properties are underwritten for long-term success, and there's huge amounts of capital put into the properties in order to do that. Affordable housing is interacting with market housing in an unprecedented way. It means in the same building through some of the programs that have been reformed over time. And to the extent you want to participate, partnerships are key. So partnering with people like your local council member, local community groups, banks, there is really a sophisticated industry of which these four are massive participants in. And I'll just add, it's not just nonprofits doing the work. Even though we have 2 nonprofits represented at the table, actually 4, really, and 3 and 1 public benefit corporation, and it gets complex. We speak in acronyms and legal terms, but there are a lot of for-profits that participate in this, and and they partner with nonprofits. There is a whole construction industry around this work, and it's a very complex ecosystem of which there are opportunities to partner. So with that, I will open it up for questions. Arthur?
So I have a question. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's a great panel, fantastic panel. Thank you so much. When I was running the Long Island City Astoria Chamber of Commerce, and we were going through a renaissance, and the development community was coming in talking about the new buildings, the affordable buildings that were coming, and NYC, EDC came in and they were pitching how great this was going to be for the community. And part of the pitch was teachers, firemen, policemen, the people who really need the affordability because their incomes, they work hard for the public, but I don't think I ever saw that. I'm just asking, is there any?
I would disagree. So.
Go ahead.
Is there?
Well, so when you talk about Lion City, so we've done transactions in Hunter's Point where there is a mix of housing and different income levels, and actually each of those talks about mixed income housing. So mixed income in New York goes from extremely low, very low income, to moderate, to middle, and middle is really is picking up people who are making $100 to even up to about $135,000. So we do have programs that really kind of deal with a spectrum. And partly it's because New York is so expensive, so that people who are making $100,000 in most of the country feel really good. They buy a house, they're all happy. In New York, they struggle. And so we do recognize that, and we are trying to build more workforce housing supply for that. So there is stuff going on, and the 421A program that got modified by the state allows for a lot of units that, once again, are targeted at people making 130% of the area median income. We use that term a lot, median income. So for New York, for a family of 4, that's closing in on $100,000 is 100% median. So 130% is close to $130,000. So that's what we're talking about. We have a fair amount of programs for that. And we really do see it on the application side, the different kinds of people and the different income levels that there are, and the different people who end up qualifying. So it is a part of what we're doing.
Was there any kind of a preference for teachers,
Yes.
policemen, firemen, the people who...
There's a 5% community, there's a 50% community preference, so by community board, and then within that there's also a 5% public worker preference. There's also preferences for people with disabilities. There's other programs for homeless. We have a lot of different things, but there are preferences. All of that stuff is available on the websites. Whenever you see an advertisement for something, you'll see a description of all of that information. It's in small print, but it's there.
Frank, do you want to add anything?
Well, I know there's a question. One of the things that differentiates most of the housing that HCCI and St. Nick's have is that differentiates from public housing, is that public housing, your rent is based as a 30% of your income. Our housing, by and large, the rent is the rent. It's set at a very affordable level. And so then when I'm interviewing people to qualify, I'm looking at their ability to pay. And so in in a public housing, if they lose their job, their rent goes down, or they, and if they make more money, the rent goes up. In our housing, the rent is the rent. And as a result, we have a lot of people that are teachers or just regular workers or office workers or whatever, because they have to work to get there. Some of them have a voucher to pay, but, so there's a lot of those kind of people.
You mentioned that keyword voucher, because now there are lots of people with vouchers. They're veterans, they're disabilities and everything.
Veterans
And
is
landlords are very hesitant because they're telling you a history. Is there any program that you're looking to implement that can train those voucher holders and educate them so that they can be better tenants for landlords to be more encompassing?
I don't think it's the tenants, okay? New York City has a law where it's illegal to discriminate against people, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen.
Right.
And one of the burdens on the property owner is that the apartment has to be inspected to make sure that it's an appropriate. Which is what has to happen, because we don't want to be giving a voucher to somebody to live in a squalid, horrible conditions.
Right.
But that kind of thing frightens many property owners that shouldn't be in many cases, that frightens them off from doing what they have to do, and so they find ways to, the same way you can discriminate against people with kids, even though that's illegal, right? I mean, there's a lot of things. So I think that HPD, which is one of the purveyors, as well as NYCHA of the vouchers, tries to do a very good job to inform people of their rights, and it's really about them being able to recognize and see that.
The lotteries are great tools there as well. So the lotteries for affordable housing, because their owners are more, they're more of the affordable participants. They're more comfortable with vouchers, they understand it, and actually there's a payment incentive in some of those instances for them to take them. So there's a lot of opportunity, but obviously it's a super competitive environment, and so it's challenging. We hear you.
Well, the complaint that people have is that they apply. I have people who tell me they're applying to buy as well as they're applying to rent. And they've been doing this for so long and they're not making any headway. So that's the issue that we have to pull and tell.
One of the things that HCI does very well is the work with the tenants. We actually structure tenant associations in all of our buildings. We find that as developers and managers of the buildings, if the tenants buy in and care for the building, they accept it as their own. They'll take care of it, and then the building will last longer in terms of repairs. So that's one of the things we do. We also help people to improve their credit if their credit rating is in poor shape. We have a credit builder program. We will help people transition from renting to ownership through our first-time home buying program. And if someone wants to become a business owner, then we help them do that. We have a first-time entrepreneurs program. So I think the wraparound services for key nonprofits will help, mitigate those issues that might come with people who have socialization issues, or the perception of people with socialization issues.
So we are at time. Thank you everybody for coming. Hopefully we introduced you.